All right, welcome everybody to March's episode of the Cyber Lookback IronNet edition. I am joined by some fantastic individuals today, and we're going to be digging into this episode titled Mac, Malware, and More. Now, this is going to include a number of deep dives and news about indictments that just occurred in the past month and into the beginning of March. Now, with me today is IronNet's new threat analysis lead, who's been driving innovation at IronNet for years while staying at the forefront of threats hitting sectors and nations across the globe. Peter Rudzinski, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Joel.
Absolutely. Now, also with me today, unfortunately for the last time for a little bit, is an individual who typically is the wizard behind the curtain. He's an excellent threat hunter, and he's an all-around stellar individual. Brett Fitzpatrick, thanks for letting us steal you again for today's show.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now, real quick, for those of you joining in, I know we just went live, but I want to do some quick housekeeping while we get more people hopping on to this live stream. Please, we're here to deliver the threat intelligence and the cyber look back to you. So if you have questions, if you have comments, please, please, please throw them in the chat here for our two subject matter experts today. We want to address your questions. Also, for those of you who are already on, if you could smash the thumbs up button, the clap button, or the support button, that will let me give you a shout out and allow us to see who's all on. So please hit those emojis down here at the bottom of the LinkedIn Live so that we can see who's on today's show. All right, Peter, Brett, are you guys ready?
Let's do it.
I think so.
So before we jump into today's content, we actually had some breaking news that we're not actually going to do a deep dive on today. But Peter, you have some resources available for our participants today, correct?
Yeah, Joel, that's correct. Yeah, over the last few days, we've gotten a barrage of news about some CVEs that affect O365 and specifically Outlook over the web. So if you're running an internal Exchange server, it's really important that you pay attention to these. Again, as you mentioned, Joel, we're not going to deep dive on this as details are still sort of coming in. And we'll definitely cover this over on the next cyber look back, but we did want to provide some indicators of compromise as well as the existing reporting that we've observed that definitely covers what you need to know as a defender if you want to address this, if you think you may have been affected. So we're going to have some in the chat, the three reports that are best at helping defenders identify this activity on their networks if they do think they were affected. So incoming.
Absolutely. So just so you guys are aware, Christine Baker is going to be posting these links here in the LinkedIn chat. So just be aware those links are coming from Peter Rudzinski via Christine Baker. Quick shout out to a few people who are on. Looks like Brian Grace is on. Looks like we have Phil Hillhouse, Stuart Cook. We also have Paul MacGyver and Nadeem Akbar. Guys, so welcome. Thank you for joining. Thank you for clicking the thumbs up button so we can see who's on here. And we're going to now jump into our content. So Peter, you mentioned the on-prem Exchange servers that are currently vulnerable and being exploited if it's hosted on-premise. Those resources are coming here shortly. But let's jump into today's content. We got a lot to cover. Let's jump into the main article about Mac malware. Peter, talk to me about this new Mac malware and why people are jumping all over it.
Yeah, so originally I think the reporting got a little out of hand on this one. And that's why we decided to join in the fun and sort of use a clickbaity article title. So I'll fully concede that we did that, but we did it for a reason, and it's actually to dispel some of the misconceptions around what's going on here. Originally, essentially the background on this is that we see a brand new malware family that appears to have popped up. And it didn't just pop up on a couple laptops. We saw this on over 30,000 Macs, or sorry, I should say just under 30,000 Macs. And this was spread across over 153 countries, primarily targeting the standard US, UK, Canada, France, and Germany, your bigger Western countries. But you are still seeing a very widespread. And so this quickly caught the attention of researchers and defenders. And then it seems that people got a little bit confused around the fact that it targets or is compatible with the new Mac silicon chip, the M1 chip. Now, this is what people seem to sort of hone in on and focus on. And in reality, that's not as novel as it might first appear. Just because you're seeing a new, CPU out there, new implementation, new architecture, this doesn't mean that it's that challenging for an attacker to write malware and compile it for that. We have compilers that compile for any number of different architectures, and ensuring that your code is compatible with that nowadays is not really that tricky. And furthermore, Brett's going to talk a little bit about this in greater detail. There are some other ways that backwards compatibility was built into the M1 chip, and so just because you've compiled something for the M1 chip itself doesn't necessarily make it super novel or the only thing that will execute on a new M1 chip. So the background on this one, though, is that basically Red Canary came out and provided a report. They were the original research organization that discovered this one, and they dubbed it Silver Sparrow. And so the real part that is novel about this attack is, again, as I mentioned, the spread and the rapid access that they were able to get, the rapid spread that they were able to achieve. But then furthermore, the way that the malware communicates with the Mac system. And that's really the part that's more interesting about this, and is why we decided to still include it in today's discussions, even though it was a little bit of a misconception about the M1 chip. So specifically, the malware is beaconing for commands to check for a second stage binary, but we haven't seen any second stage binaries yet. And so this indicates that they have widespread, but we haven't quite seen what the actions are that the attackers are intending to do. So that's one interesting point here, which leads us to question: are they going to deploy ransomware? Are they going to deploy some form of information stealer or whatever? It's unclear at this time. So we don't know what the true intentions are. However, another interesting point here is that the malware does include a hard kill switch that would actually entirely remove the malware from the system, the target system at hand. This isn't incredibly rare to see, but it is definitely an indication that the target, or I should say the attackers, are fairly sophisticated and intend to clean themselves up after they leave. And so we haven't seen this feature take effect yet, obviously, but looking out for that as well. And additionally, another interesting point here, as I was mentioning, is the fact that the malware itself communicates using the JavaScript API to execute commands instead of more traditional means. And so this makes analysis of this piece of malware a little bit more difficult, as it's not a traditional means of interacting with the Mac OS itself. And so right off the bat, that again highlights a little bit more sophistication. So we've got the spread, we've got the kill switch. Now we have a somewhat novel means of communicating with the Mac OS itself. And then on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, we also have indications that the C2 infrastructure that the bots are communicating with are actually built in AWS and Akamai, which indicates, again, a robust, highly fault-tolerant implementation of C2 that is blending in with legitimate services as well. So this is a problem for our stronger, more popular VPSs, virtual server providers like AWS, who people look at and sort of take for granted as benign, legitimate traffic. And so it really does indicate an interesting threat from those perspectives more than it does from the actual compilation and M1 chip compatibility perspective itself.
No, great ad, Peter. And Brett, Peter mentioned you had a few more comments on this.
Yeah, so going back to the malware, I would say it's pretty anticlimactic in that if you had a malicious binary that you wanted to execute on a target system that was based on that new M1 chip and was the ARM64 architecture versus the x86 architecture, it is actually still going to run on that new Mac. And that's because Apple, they knew that there's going to be a need for backwards compatibility. So they set up a translator called Rosetta, which will actually translate that Intel x86 architecture into the ARM64 instruction set architecture. So it's a little bit anticlimactic in that, in that like it's no really new novel new exploit or anything like that. Just really that it's now compiled in ARM. And this is something that we're expecting to see, because most of this code is really just code, right? Like they have developers too. They have their own life cycle process. So we knew this was going to happen, that they're going to update their code, and we're just seeing that evolution of their code base.
Yeah, fantastic. And then Apple also released news that it's been able to reduce any further spread of the malware. It looks like they're also going to be issuing regular software updates to stop its devices from being infected further. I also believe this is more proof. Peter talked about this malware, beaconing out to C2 servers on typically seen VPS providers, right? Like Amazon, Akamai, I'm sure Azure and GCP are, the next best options. But this is another example of having behavioral detections, even for the small to mid-sized business, category, it's going to be a necessity moving forward, right? Now, this isn't the only example of the Mac malware, right? Peter, you mentioned that similar things have been exploited before, and I'm sure we'll see it again here in the future. So I believe that this next type of attack could potentially be even more widespread, right? If they can make it deployed easier and exploited at scale. So Peter, let's continue on, though. We still have a lot more to cover. There was some more supply chain confusion and exploits occurring in regards to code repos, dependency confusion. And I know we're just coming out of SolarWinds and the SolariGate incident. Can you talk to me more about what's happening in the supply chain attack that Ars Technica had an article about?
Yeah, so you're referring to the news that came out a couple weeks ago regarding the standard, typical code repository servers that are essentially vulnerable to a interesting type of dependency resolution process that allows an attacker to get code to execute on a target system just simply by them attempting to update internal packages. I'll get into the specifics of that, but first I'd like to draw a distinction between this type of supply chain attack and a supply chain attack closer to what SolarWinds looked like, where in the case of SolarWinds, you have a company that's delivering software as an update to their paid customers, and that software update is indeed compromised. In this case, that's not what's happening. In this case, this is more to do with open source code usage. And this is actually where researchers and defenders have been focusing a lot on in the past few years, because it's popped up in a number of different ways, similar to what we're seeing here, but in different permutations of that. And so the actual means for getting this malicious code to execute on systems, it does follow a supply chain. It is different from what we're seeing with SolarWinds, but it's almost more important to pay attention to. And I'll get into the specifics of why that is now. So background on this is a security researcher, Alex Barson, was chasing a few payouts for red teaming engagements, and basically demoed a supply chain attack in this case that leverages the automatic dependency resolution processes that are built into the code repository servers, like I was referring to. This is things like PyPy, NPM, Ruby gems, all the standard ways that your operating system or your programming languages receive binaries, or I should say receive packages and libraries. And so the security researcher, Alex, he actually was incredibly successful with this, and was able to get access and execute code on over 30 companies. So not only was he able to run the gambit and get access to a number of different companies, some of the companies were fairly reputable and fairly mature. So that included Apple, Microsoft, and Tesla, which is kind of remarkable if you think about it, given their nature and given what just happened in December with SolarWinds. So the way the attack works, though, specifically, is actually really simple. And it's surprising to me that this is the first time we're hearing about this. But nonetheless, the way the attack works is people and companies run internal software packages for their own needs. And typically, those are uniquely named. However, what Alex Barson determined or found out was that even if you're running an internal package, your PyPy server or your NPM server may not know that that is actually supposed to be only an internal package. And if you attempt to update your software and there is also an external publicly available package with the same name but a higher version number, your PyPy server will automatically go out and grab that new updated version, which wasn't written by you or anybody internally and could have been uploaded as by anybody. So the first step for this attack is identifying where a company or an organization might use internal packages and find that name. At that point, you create a package with the same name, you include your malicious executable code, and then you publish a version number that is higher, or what you can hope is higher than the version number that's published internally, which triggers that internal code server to go and grab that updated version from the public servers. So you can see it's actually really straightforward. And this is absolutely behavior we would expect if you were downloading, say, a more publicly available package, like, for example, with Python requests. You would expect it to go and grab an updated version for you if you requested it. However, in this case, with private repositories, private code packages, that's not the intent. So it really does represent an inherent design flaw with regard to these servers, because that is built into the logic of how they function. So, and again, one more distinction I want to draw here is that this is not like the typo squatting that we've seen. And that's actually the traditional supply chain attack for code repos that we've seen in the past, where attackers will attempt to register packages that are very close to the package name of a legitimate package, attempting to hijack users who accidentally fat finger something and instead include their malicious package by accident. So that is not what we're seeing here. This is, in fact, actually the exact same name as the legitimate package. It's just hosted publicly versus internally in this case.
So Peter, let me ask you a question, because we're coming out of the SolarWinds incident. So if I have this correct, let's say your code uses Python requests, right? And you actually use that open source package in your software that you would then deploy to your clients. So you're telling me a malicious actor could take Python requests, add malicious close, repackage it, basically increment the package version number by 1. And if that organization doesn't specify the version number, it will pull that malicious package, and they could hypothetically deploy that with their software to their clients?
That's absolutely correct. Now, the only point there that I would point out is that with requests and any other legitimately written but publicly available code that is hosted on these servers, those are tightly controlled, and the means for injecting code into requests is definitely not easy. There's lots of review that goes on in the open source community. People would spot this. It has happened in the past. People do spot it quickly. It's something to pay attention to, but it gets rooted out. This is mainly when you have an internal only package that has a unique name that it doesn't exist publicly. At that point, the attacker installs that unique name, but uploads it publicly, and now you've got a problem.
Interesting. So we could even be more looking at insider threat, right? If you know the instructions for your organization is run this update and it doesn't have a version number on it, and it's going to reach out and grab one, somebody with internal knowledge of that code base could then put it external, potentially no attribution back to them, but then other people in their organization could grab that package or resource.
It's important to mention that, but I almost hate you for saying it, because yeah, that's what scares me the most is internal threat on this case. This really gives a +1 to any internal person who's looking to do damage to their company. So yeah, people need to pay attention to this from an external perspective, but absolutely, this is an internal threat. Yep.
No, great. Thank you for walking me through that. And I know I was kind of putting you on the spot with those, but
no problem.
Excellently. So let's keep going, because we had some indictments from North Korea. Now, the indictments that we mentioned at the very beginning of this, they are for North Korea, right? These are around the North Korean threat actors, and the breaches that they have been linked to are really interesting, right? So these threat actors have been called hacktivists numerous times, and they've been seen targeting not only organizations, but countries who were attempting to smear the infamous Kim leadership in North Korea. But there's so much more that they've actually been linked to. And Brett, I'm hoping you can dig deeper into this for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So the Wired article that came out recently was a decent summary of the past North Korean heists and scams around crypto. So until now, only one person has been identified and indicted, but two more have been included in this recent charge. I'm not going to go with trying to pronunciate their names, but it was Park, John, and Kim. And the hacking group they belong to has been identified as the Lazarus Group, or as we know, APT31. Charges include hacking of banks and crypto exchanges, as well as the deployment of WannaCry. Interestingly enough, they were also charged with the attacks against Mammoth and AMC theaters during the release of the movie The Interview. Most remarkably, though, they plan to release a homegrown cryptocurrency called the Marine Chain. And this was meant to allow people to purchase a stake in seafaring cargo ships. Any indictments of North Korean citizens are extremely rare, so I thought this was pretty interesting in that, like, to get a photo and the actual name of someone in North Korea is pretty difficult, considering, you don't have access to social media sites, or getting a photo of, the post star, seeing, where their workplace is. It's pretty difficult in North Korea, given their culture and their level of censorship. So, seeing that we were able to get a picture of them and get the names of the individuals and specifically what campaigns they actively worked on, I thought that was a huge win for the U.S. government and authorities alike.
Yeah, no, I think that's great context, Brett. And we're talking all the way back to WannaCry, right? Then we're talking about the Sony breach with the movie The Interview, where they were making fun of Kim Jong-un. And then it was interesting. This same group was actually linked with a Bangladesh bank heist that happened years ago, where they abused the Swift wire transfer system. They were able to siphon off $81 million. Now, the really crazy part about that heist was that it would have been over $1 billion heist if it weren't for a printer error that stopped them. So really interesting stuff that was all linked to these indictments. And we got a picture of them, right? We have the names, we have the group they were a part of. It looks like a few of them are newer, but there's definitely Park, I believe, was one of the original members. So
Yep.
They were able to link him to all of that. So really interesting stuff. Now, let's jump over to a new type of malware that's being spread using search engine optimization techniques. You know, Brett, this next topic, it's really crazy that now threat actors are using search engine optimization, getting the links to the top of search engines, and enabling people to download that malware, right? When it's the top link in Google, which is normally trusted, right?
Yeah.
Now, curiously enough, Microsoft gave a release on Tuesday that said it's seeing numerous attacks of this, and it's mostly targeting Germany. Can you dig a little deeper into this for me?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to our previous discussion of, malicious developers are developers again, and they're going to use whatever is out there to make their malware more prevalent, or the first link on the Google search. So yeah, definitely not a surprise we're seeing that. But a quick just background on what Gootkit is, what Gootloader is. So Gootkit is a banking Trojan where large parts are written in JavaScript, specifically using Node.js. And it jumps to a C, C++ library functions for the other various tasks it's going to do. So it has now been seeing, like Joel said, pushing a wide variety of malware via hacked WordPress sites and malicious SEO techniques for Google results. And this activity did restart. So we did see a turn down of operations around the end of 2019. And this was after a huge data leak that occurred for the Gootkit operators. So we did see, obviously this activity is coming back. And with the reemergence, we saw that they now have a vast network of compromised WordPress sites and are using SEO to poison and to show Google forum posts and fake forums with malicious links in the top of Google search results.
Oh, yeah.
We are still seeing typical Gootkit stuff. So the still a JavaScript payload for initial infection, led by a C# payload, which is then used for extracting the final .NET payload. So still similar code architecture on that side of things. And just again, highly recommend looking at the Sophos article for some more technical granular details on that.
No, thank you, Brett. Now, Peter, real quick, just quick question on this. It's being seen targeting Germany. I'm assuming that's because each country, or at least regional area, has its own #1 page on Google, right? Do you foresee this spreading to other countries and regions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Before I dodge that answer, I will tell you that that's probably the most remarkable part about this occurrence is the fact that it wasn't just using search engine optimization to boost its Google web page result location, but it was more used to specifically target certain users. And it actually made the phishing that they used within these compromised WordPress sites that would get a user to click a link, it made the phishing much more potent, because the fact that it was so targeted and so well crafted for the specific web searches that a person put in, or forum posts that a person submitted, the way that they actually did that really made it compelling. So as a strong user, I looked at this and thought, man, that's so tailored to the question that was asked. I don't even think I would have suspected phishing until a little further down the attack chain. And so, yeah, no, I think it's more remarkable on the side of how well it targets a particular group or person, and how potent it makes that phishing link itself. To answer your question, sort of, I would say, obviously, I can't think of any attacker that would do something like this for info stealing and personally, by choice, limit themselves to just one area of operation. When you see people like this, when you see crime organizations like this, they may target certain locations and everything, but more is always better. And so, yeah, I would absolutely expect to see this start branching out and hitting other areas. And that's not to say that there aren't already other targets that they're looking at. It's just we did observe, or the researchers did observe that this is where it was mostly targeting at this time.
And Peter, if you think about it, when we're going back to college, I don't know about you, but when I was looking for new information on a topic I was getting discussed in class, if I'm looking for a textbook or if I'm looking for a slide deck on that topic, there's a good chance whatever Google pops up for results for me, those first couple links, I'm going to go out and click one of those results. If it's a PDF or a any document where they can include some code into and hope that they can social engineer you to click macros or anything like that, then they can easily open a gateway into that user's host.
Oh, that's
absolutely
great. Now, real quick, it would be interesting because Peter, Brett, if I send you a phishing link and it's in German or Chinese, you're not clicking that link, right? You're probably backing right out of that page.
Oh, not.
But so I think that's interesting is they're keeping their net wide. It's targeting Germany as a whole, right? A subset of people who speak a similar language, who have a similar culture, but still, that's still a pretty wide net. So really interesting stuff. Now let's come back to the United States. We just saw the second state enact a new data privacy law. Now this is Virginia, and it's the first state since California enacted the CCPA back in 2018. It's really interesting. We've seen other countries and groups such as the European Union enact GDPR. And since then, we haven't seen a lot of new laws. So, Peter, do you think that with Virginia passing its own version, that it's going to start creating a more cascading effect of other states and countries refocusing on these types of laws?
I mean, absolutely. We've already seen that happen. And I would say it wasn't Virginia that got that ball rolling. It was actually California. In 2018, they passed their first, attempt at this, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and it went into effect actually 1 year ago, almost exactly, in January 1 of 2020. So we do have some history here as well. There are some interesting lawsuits that are currently underway that were based on violations of that act. So very interesting stuff from that perspective. But I really do think it was California that got the ball rolling with this kind of thing. That's not super surprising either. Nonetheless, one that came after that. So it's interesting to see what differences they chose to put in there and what similarities they also chose to include based on the California one, as well as GDPR. But to get into the specifics here, as I mentioned, they did model it somewhat closely off of the California version here for Virginia. But there are some differences. I will fully admit at this point, I am not super up on the policies of these. And if you are interested, there are a number of resources that go into the specifics of it. And there's a lot of legal implications and very specific wording that determines how these laws will be enacted and such. But obviously, we live in a country that's built on jurisprudence as well. And so we'll have to really keep an eye out on what lawsuits come out afterwards and how those are decided upon, because that's what's going to really determine whether these laws have teeth or whether they're just, sort of in not very effective at, locking down users' data. But again, to the Virginia specifics, in this case, basically they had chose to go with a opt-out model, which means that users have the ability to request their data so that they can see what companies have access to them. It allows them to request deletion of data. So pretty standard stuff from that perspective. But one interesting thing that I thought, or a few interesting things I pulled out here that I thought are worth noting are the fact that the legislation applies to people or individuals only if a company operating in or outside of Virginia has 100,000 or more Virginia residents' data on their systems. And so I think the reason for this is because, and they sort of outlined that, is that they didn't want to target small businesses, because small businesses notoriously have a very difficult time managing this type of thing due to the fact that they don't have very mature IT automation processes. And so you can imagine if somebody asked, hey, can you clean my data off your systems? A small business is not going to be able to click a button and have that take place immediately. Where larger organizations have an onus to do that really themselves as well. Additionally, another interesting distinction here is that the covered consumers can also be a household, but they can be an individual or a household, but they cannot be somebody who's operating in the context of a business. So if you're at work doing work stuff, you're fully able to store that data. Companies are fully able to store that data, and you cannot go to them and ask for that data to be removed. So, I can think of a number of things that I do that are primarily tied to my work activities, and would obviously not fall under scope for this law. A quick note on that is this makes it incredibly challenging in my eyes to uphold this law, because how is an organization supposed to determine that my activities are related to work or not? And so when I say, hey, I want you to delete my data, when are they and how are they able to say, no, we're not going to delete that because you were operating in the context of your business or your work? So I think that's one interesting distinction that I'd love to see how that plays out, because that's not, I think it's going to get messy. I don't think that's very clear. So similarly to the GDPR, though, this, like I said, does allow users to opt out. And one other thing that they can do is correct inaccurate data that an organization has. So I thought that was also pretty interesting here. Probably the most interesting thing that I'm conflicted on. I think I like it as an element of this law, but I'm not sure. Again, we'll have to see how this plays out. But what I thought was most interesting is that the law does not allow individuals to put forward lawsuits. No individual has the ability to take action on a violation of this policy, but rather the Virginia State Attorney General must take up these cases. So this doesn't mean that you can't report violations of this, but what I think this does is it means that a single person reporting a violation is never going to turn into a lawsuit. You're going to require a body of people to come and say, hey, this business is not upholding their end of this law. And at that point, the Attorney General would say, yeah, I think this is worth us taking some action on. And so I actually think this is a good thing, because GDPR and all of these laws have shifted the balance back towards the consumer. But I think that we need to remember that all of the digital services and honestly the internet that we have today is built on monetization of data. You can't watch YouTube videos for free because of Google being a nice guy. They monetize that through other means. And so there are some elements of data collection that are good for us as consumers as well. And so it's important to understand that there is a balance too. And so having individuals putting forward frivolous lawsuits that cost organizations millions to go through, even if they come out on top, doesn't help the situation very much. Whereas true violations in a systemic form that then the Attorney General can take up, that's really what we want to focus on, right? So I'm a little conflicted, because I do think that individuals should have the ability to say, hey, this is wrong, but at the same time, preventing frivolous lawsuits and overuse of the law is important. And so on that note, my final point here would be that it should be noted that opt-out based laws like this favor the organizations, not the individuals. And that's because, if you can imagine, as an individual, I have to go to all of the locations that I may know or may not know are collecting my data and ask them to delete it. So the onus is on me, and I have to invest time and effort into going and saying, hey, don't collect data on me if I want them to not collect data on me. And again, I'll go back to, if you don't like the data collections on the internet, there's an element of responsibility on your end to ensure that you're operating in a privacy-centric way on the internet. But at the same time, I will absolutely concede that an opt-out based law like this probably needs some additional tools for the user, the end user, to actually say, hey, this is wrong, you need to delete my data. That then they don't have to go to 1,000 organizations and say, hey, delete my data, right? So there is a balance, and I'm not sure they've struck it at this time, but I do like the slow approach, and hopefully we can build on this law to put forward a more complete, robust way for individuals to access and delete their data from organizations that are collecting on them.
No, I like it, and that's an interesting perspective on how it's favoring the organizations to the individual. I think for me personally, I'm sure that the Virginia Attorney General's office doesn't scale well, right? So if they have a lot of issues, they're going to have to pick which ones they address. Whereas in California, I know we were looking at it earlier this week or last week, but CCPA, there's a number of class action lawsuits against organizations in the last 12 months, right? And a few of those are around the Salesforce and Marriott breaches that have occurred. And I think the more interesting ones that are occurring in California, the lawsuits right now, are the biometric data leaks that have occurred, right? There's been a genetics organization named Ambry Genetics that leaked genetic information on people. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think, unfortunately, we say it's favoring the corporations, not the end user. But I still think, these class actions, they favor the law offices more than the end user too. So hopefully we can find a better balance here in the near future.
Agreed.
Now, Peter, before we jump into the next topic, Mr. Lal mentioned something. I'm going to throw it on the screen. He said, is Qualys suffering a data breach? And this is more news that's likely going to be covered next month in next month's Cyber Lookback. It does look like an extortion gang has breached potentially an Excellion server that was located in their DMZ. So it was segmented off from the rest of their internal network. But that's all pretty speculatory at this time. So we will be covering that in next month's edition. So let's keep going, though, because there's a really interesting one that occurred last month. And this was when a hacker attempted to put lye, or a toxic chemical, into the Florida water supply system through a water utility breach. Now, the hacker appears to have compromised the water treatment plant's TeamViewer software. Once again, TeamViewer, it seems like we still can't get away from it. But what it did was then it gained remote access to the target computer, that the network logs confirmed that the operator's mouse takeover that occurred. Now, the sheriff that reported it had little else to share about how the hacker accessed TeamViewer, right? And I wouldn't expect him to, but he also didn't know how they gained initial access into the plant's IT network. He did provide absolutely zero details on how they got into the OT network as well. Now, there was a question that was asked, did this come from down the street or was it from outside the country? And once again, he had no idea. So, Brett, you've done some research into this. This is another example of cyber attacks attempting to cause physical harm to people. Dig into this just a little bit more for us.
Yeah, I'll probably provide some commentary, but I'll have Peter dive in a little bit more to the nitty-gritty details of this. But I just want to say, this was another example of cyber attacks attempting to cause physical harm, as well as another example of a pretty low sophisticated requirement in order to cause physical harm as well. So it wasn't, a sophisticated APT or a country, trying to commit an act of war. It appears to be just, some script kiddie, in his basement. So, it just goes to show with the information that's available to researchers out there, just the amount of harm you could potentially cause. And those, people out there that are, looking to do some nefarious actions or are, performing security testing should be made aware of, the implications of what, these actions could potentially cause to a city and its people. So yeah, I'll just, pass it over to Peter for any more details.
Yeah, I would say it's sad to see something like this happen. But to Brett's point, it's not certain that it isn't an APT or external country, but it would be pretty just honestly stupid for a country to do something like this. Because as Brett mentioned, it does represent an act of war. When you start diving into the physical world and you start affecting physical things, even there's been discussion around interruption of service of electrical systems as potentially an act of war because of the kinetic side effects of that. In this case, humans would be harmed. There would be harm to life. And in that case, I don't think there's any way of looking at it if an external country, a malicious country that, has an objective harming human life in the United States. I don't see how you could categorize that as anything but an act of war. And so, yeah, for a country to do that, I'm sure they would have done it differently. They would have done it much more. I don't think you would have detected it just by immediately you see TeamViewer, a mouse navigating on a computer that shouldn't be. I don't think you would see something like I be just astronomically increased. I forget the exact ratio, but it was something like 80 times the amount that was supposed to be in there. So it quickly triggered systems that were like, this isn't correct. And so it just doesn't have that tricky sophistication that you would expect some country that knows the implications of the actions would take. And so, yeah, ultimately, I think this is even more sad because of that, though, because I think that somebody's life is going to be ruined by the fact that they made a stupid decision to do something like this. And I think that's permanent damage. We saw this with the Twitter hacks where, you know, some young guys who just wanted to get some street cred and thought it was super fun posted the crypto scams on Elon Musk's and on Obama's Twitter, you know, and a number of others. You can just feel the sophistication surrounding these types of attacks is just not there. And the thought behind what are we going to do with this level of access? You know, access into an organization like this is valuable. And what did they do? They dumped lie into it. And, you know, what did they do? They just posted a crypto scam on Twitter. It feels very similar where you just don't have a lot of thought behind what am I going to do with this access? And so, yeah, I'm upset to think about the fact that this is probably somebody who didn't really understand the implications of what they were doing, because it's all behind the, you know, keyboard and all behind a monitor, and it doesn't feel real when this is going to be very real, and is definitely something we really need to pay attention to. And the final thing I'll leave you with is that is troubling from the attacker's perspective, but it's really troubling from the defender's perspective too. If a kid could get in here and use TeamViewer to increase the amount of a toxic chemical in a water supply for an entire city, you've got a problem, and we really want to pay attention to that. And, you know, without going into too much detail, why are they not using? There's no easy button for remote access. Why are they not using the standard remote access tools that are built into Windows that are locked down and hardened in a better way than TeamViewer? There's no easy button. I understand that, but at the same time, there are ways, you know, at that point, the attacker would have had to fully compromise Active Directory or compromise an account on Active Directory or something like that versus taking advantage of some simple TeamViewer exploit. So, you know, you want to say, like, come on, guys, let's get it together. This is a water utility, you know?
Yeah, well, and I just keep seeing TeamViewer in use over and over and over again, and there's always some excuse that it's in use, and there's very little security controls around it, right? So it's driving me personally crazy because you're right. Not only if this was a nation-state actor would there have been more sophistication, maybe they could have bypassed some of those security controls. And if they could have, we're talking about chemical warfare, right? And this type of chemical warfare wouldn't have differentiated between adults and children, and all of which were most likely civilians. That's really scary stuff to think about, right? So when we're talking about security professionals, it's been long advised that you segregate your IT and OT, and you make sure OT is not connected to the internet. But still, we're seeing, you know, through IT, or, you know, people and hackers pivoting into OT, and that's why we as an organization we're so focused on monitoring the IT network segment to help restrict that dwell time and those accesses. So thank you, Peter, for that. Now let's jump in. I know we've already kind of crossed time, but we did see something named the IronNet Injector hit the streets. Now this wasn't related to IronNet in any way, shape, or form, but Peter, walk me through the IronNet Injector real quick.
Yeah, this was a funny one, and when it dropped, everybody at IronNet obviously was like, "Wait a second, what did we do?" So, no, you're right. I should repeat what you said. This has nothing to do with IronNet. It actually is it's funny. It's a probably Palo Alto had no idea what they were doing at the time, but it's actually because of the involvement of a software called IronPython, and then a Net Injector. And so they decided, hey, how do we stick those two things together? IronPython Net Injector is a little bit of a mouthful. How do we shorten that up? Oh, perfect. IronNet Injector, not IronNet Injector, right? So little funny play on words there, but no, nothing to do with IronNet. However, this is just another fantastic report out of the folks at Unit 42. Really appreciate the work they do, and they always put forward really good stuff. But basically, this is Turla malware that leverages, like I was describing, the software package or software platform IronPython, which is kind of an interesting open source implementation of Python that's tightly integrated with the .NET framework, which gives developers the ability to execute both .NET libraries and APIs alongside the Python code. So it's basically a nice blend of the two. And so for developers, it's a really nice way of not having to fully just run applications that are .NET versus Python, but rather you leverage both functionalities, which is really powerful. So This attack technique, though, is commonly referred to, and we've seen this before, as like bring your own interpreter, BYOI. So, we've seen this before, but in this case, it was interesting to see that .NET framework or that .NET injector packaged in with it. And so the outline that Unit 42 put together is heavily focused on those host-based indicators and how it operates on the host. They didn't include too many network details, so we won't dive into any of that. But if you are interested in how this affected the host of the operating system that it was targeting, there's a lot of good detail behind how it maintained persistence and how it operated on the host itself. So again, really good stuff out of Unit 42, but not IronNet related. So.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that clarification, Peter. Well, we did have a speculation segment that we had planned, but we have gone over time. So we're going to save that for next month and see if anything arises around that speculation segment. But once again, Brett Fitzpatrick, Peter Rudzinski, thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us on March's Cyber Lookback.
Thanks, Joel.
Joel, thank you.
You got it. Now, a couple things for those of you listening. We have our IronNet's monthly threat intelligence report that was just released this morning. We will have that on ironnet.com for anybody who's interested. Also, we have April's cyber look back on April Fool's Day. So April 1st is the first Thursday of every single month. We will have cyber experts next month, including Peter Rudzinski and Joe Fitzpatrick. So we'll be coming to you live. Brett, thank you once again for joining us on the last few cyber lookbacks. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you. It was awesome.
You got it. Everybody listening, thank you guys for paying attention. Thank you for participating. We look to bring you the best cyber news over the past 30 days in your IronNet's monthly cyber lookback. Gentlemen, have a great rest of your day. Everybody participating, we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Joel.
Take care.